a lot of people. We have a lot of different backgrounds here. We have docents, we have librarians, we have curators, we have people from Alabama, we have people from New York. So we have people all over. It's so great. So this Art and Letters is about the book, which is about IM Pei. And this is going to be led by our MMFA Curator of Education, Alice Novak. And so we are so thrilled, as Alice has such a passion for architecture, and we're so thrilled she was able to take this book and lead this discussion. My name is Cassandra Cavness, and I'm the development assistant, and I kind of coordinate all of the art and letter programs. Just a little bit about me, I was able to get Alice in contact with some people at the Everson Museum in New York, because that's where I'm from, and I actually went to school not too far down the road from Everson. So I knew that this would be a great discussion and a great collaboration between our two museums. And I'm just going to let Alice take it away.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. And of course, this is a very special meeting of Art and Letters, as we are honoring our dear friend, architect, and teacher who was to join us today, the late Jim Barganier. He was really excited to talk to you about IM Pei and his iconic museum designs. As many of you know, he reveled in these exchanges of ideas about design, and he was so grateful and so excited about the Everson being here. So welcome again. If you are new to Art and Letters, we do ask questions of the audience and hope you will join in. And if for some reason we can't get to everybody's comments, we invite you to add them to the chat. But today, first, we're going to reflect on our museum's design and honor Jim. Then we will talk about IM Pei's museum projects, as we identified several for you to focus on, concluding with the Everson, and docent Peter Moeller is going to answer some questions about that. So the book really focused on the collaborative nature of architecture, and Jim was such an energizing collaborative force, whether he was working on our building, our garden, a presentation with staff, or he and his wife Jane were serving on a committee and adding their insights and fun. And to open up the conversation, Margaret Lynn had a great idea that we go back and look in the Advertiser archives, our archives, for the articles about when the museum opened. So I just have a few quotes to share with you, and then would love to get your impressions of your experience of the museum. And so on September 18th, 1988, in the Montgomery Advertiser, there was one article that had a lot of description, including of the rotunda, which of course is the dramatic space that we walk into. I believe people in Syracuse were able to view some images of the museum and have a sort of an idea of what our museum is like. But the journalist wrote, the subtle colors within this volume reflect the natural light that cascades into the interior, perceptibly changing color in tandem with sky colors beyond. And goes on to say, the architect's use of simple, honest materials, changes of scale, clean lines, and well-defined volumes engages you with a calculated certainty that ensures a visual feast for the eyes. And Jim was interviewed in these articles, and he commented that the cooperative efforts between both public and private principals throughout the course of this project was incredible. And with such a beautiful site and a wonderful view of the Alabama Shakespeare Festival, he wanted to create a building that faced outward and that carefully integrated views of the site from the interior. So for those of you who are visiting, we are in the same park with the Alabama Shakespeare Festival. So people in Montgomery, do any of you remember your first impressions of when the museum opened in the park and what you thought of it?
goodness. Well, I just remember thinking about Blunt's ideas that he wanted to create a cultural park, that you could come to this space and see and do and have so many experiences. And, you know, the museum was just the wonderful addition to ASF. And we are not natives, so it was an exciting time for us to come and see it.
And your new city evolving that way.
Yeah.
So what were the design challenges? What was Jim sort of tasked with? Like you said, joining the Alabama Shakespeare Festival in this park, but I mean, what else was he trying to communicate with the building?
Well,
Getting the mail.
okay. Well, you know, architecturally, they wanted the designs of the two buildings to be compatible. So it most surely was.
So this, yes, Peter.
I have not been to the museum, but I saw the lovely pictures you sent us. And my first impression was this is definitely a museum in the South. I mean, there's a lot of what I think of as a Southern culture and Southern life in your museum. And
Interesting.
that's without my actually even stepping through the door.
That's very interesting. What felt so Southern about it to you?
I think the columns and the way the light came in, and there's a kind of, it looks from the pictures you sent, it looks like it, while it's the anchor of that area with the Shakespeare Theater, et cetera, it's not the center, but it's one of many places. Is that right? That you can go to in that park?
Yes. So we have a theater, a museum, a dog park, many walking trails, always ideas. So there, as you say, a lot of environments. And it's interesting that you comment on the Southern character of the museum. Certainly, we very much focus on regional art in addition to American art. But that sort of larger environment that the museum was to fit in, that Liz was talking about, the Shakespeare Festival is sort of a Neo-Palladian design, and the park was envisioned as sort of an English countryside environment. And that really resonates with a lot of those Southern characteristics you were talking about. And certainly the building was meant to communicate an openness to the public and learning. And how would you describe the style of the museum? And Peter, you've mentioned the columns, but how would you guys describe the museum style?
Goodness. I have to ask Peter a question. Being Southern, I know you've not seen it from the outside, et cetera, just for pictures, but did it make you feel welcome? Because, you know, Southerners, we have this feeling that everybody's always welcome.
Yes.
So
Good.
Good.
I thought, yeah. I thought it was welcoming. You know, all those cliches that I have about Southern culture, you know, hospitality, kind of slowing down. It looked like a place to slow down and take your time.
Good.
Wonderful.
Well,
Any other
like the
ideas
porches.
about the style? Yes.
I was just going to say, I like the porches. That to me is, you know, welcoming too. All the porches around.
So wonderful outdoor space. And Carolyn, I think you had something to add.
It's so unlike what we have up north. That was the first thing. Also, it's the openness, which is mentioned. It's so open that we could never pull that off up here because of the snow and the cold. You have such a long season. You can spend as much time outdoors there as indoors, whereas we cannot. So that is a really glaring difference here. We're pretty much, we have great summers, terrific summers, but they're short. And our winters are long. So that's the real thing that jumped out at me. We couldn't have all of these columns and open spaces and all that. We have a very unique design, but it's definitely for colder temperatures or colder climates.
Alice, can I throw in
Yes,
something really
please.
quickly?
Yeah.
And I love hearing that. When you asked about the style of the building, I think mentioning porches and columns brings to mind just it's a very classical building.
Yes.
And
Yes.
in the South, we're all about the classical and all of the sort of tradition and the references to antiquity, all of that. One of the things that I was really impressed with Jim's design was the fact that he was able, obviously as an art museum, we have a significant interest in maintaining our interior environment and protecting the works of art from exposure to a lot of UV light and other kinds of damaging elements that are there in the natural environment. And what impressed me was that Jim really came to the project with the idea of somehow we have to accommodate the need for protecting from the outdoor environment, with including ways to access the outdoor environment, because we're sitting in the middle of an incredibly beautiful park, and one of his main things was we just can't build a bunker here, you know. And so when we did the budgeting for construction and all of the talking about the design and the actual construction process, we made sure that we included elements in it that would allow us to be able to control the light from the outside with filters and with blinds and that kind of thing, but still allow access for visitors in the building to be able to project themselves out into nature as they looked at the works of art. And to me, that's such a real blessing, because so many museums don't have that ability to put their works of art really in a natural setting, or a semi-natural setting, the way we do. And I give Jim a tremendous amount of credit for really working with us to make that possible.
So well said. Thank you so much. And for our guest, Margaret Lynn was the curator at the time, scurrying around to get the opening exhibition ready, and really just felt the impact of that design on her collection and its care. And again, this wonderful relationship to environment. Thank you. Yes, Lisa.
You know, one of the things that I'm sitting here thinking about, and that is that before the Montgomery Museum of Art, there was a museum that included art and local collections, but that were not necessarily considered fine art. And so, of course, I wasn't here during that time, but I think that in some ways, you know, Montgomery had gone through a lot of trauma earlier, and nationally, there was some damage as a result of that. And I think in some ways, creating such a thoughtful, intentional park with two different structures that supported the fine arts, one that was largely based upon what historically had considered one of the greatest writers, the Shakespeare Park and the Shakespeare environment, and the other being fine arts. And so my sense is that it was a statement that we're not just about civil rights struggles, but we're also about culture. And we also have sophistication. And for those of you who are coming to this from New York, I am from Philadelphia, have lived short time in New York and many other places around the country, and have also traveled extensively around the country. And I want to say to you that although you may see elements of architectural charm that you solely identify with the South. And although there is some interest in supporting, strong interest in supporting regional artists, we have a very respectful, thoughtful, smart team of people who put together dynamic shows, and we have a pretty strong collection too.
Thank you, Lisa. And what greater connection is there between the fight for civil rights and freedom than the ability of all citizens to be educated and to enjoy the arts? And Montgomery has certainly shown in both ways, and as you said, had some very unfortunate parts of ourselves shown too. And so in a minute, I want to let us hear from Jim himself, but with Margaret Lynn's talking about, we have a classical building, that dome, the squares and the circles, the columns, the things you've mentioned that are all evocative of Rome and Rome's love of the countryside, and then inform the English love of the countryside, the Southern love of the countryside. And those just expansive windows, those stunning vistas, to me are really Jim's signature in any building. That relationship to the natural world, of course, the garden inviting respite and imagination, centered around that water feature that's tied to the lake on the other side. And all of these things, I think, say, well, this is a place for learning, for enjoying art, the home of the muses. The visitor passes through. I think Margaret Lynn did a great job explaining kind of how the visitor experiences art and nature as they pass through this classical building. So let's listen to Jim. And we are so lucky we were able to capture him in this reading group and also on our audio tour, sort of talking about his ideas for the museum.
Welcome to the Montgomery Museum of Fine Art and the John and Joyce Cadell Sculpture Garden. I'm Jim Barganier, architect of the museum and the sculpture garden. If I may, I'd like to give you a little background. When designing the museum over 30 years ago, I imagined it as a bridge over water that would transport its visitors to wherever the exhibit, lecture, social event, or quiet time alone they experience would take them. While crossing this bridge with the adjacent lake to the west in the park, I've always wished for a source of this water to the east, on this side of the museum, to complete the concept of a bridge. A few years ago, the call to design the sculpture garden gave me the opportunity to realize that vision with the Aeronaut water wall and the louder reflecting pool that reaches almost to the museum. Approaching and surrounding that source of water, the garden was envisioned as a collection of outdoor spaces or galleries for the display of sculpture, outdoor events, learning, or just quiet time sitting on a bench. Enjoy your visit, make a really good memory, and return often. Thank you.
But Jim designed our museum, and again, more recently, its sculpture garden. Jim, when the museum is able to reopen, what do you hope it will be for Montgomery and her citizens to be able to come back to the museum?
Well, I'll zero in on just the garden at this point, because we've also had the museum building, collection, and staff as part of our lives for many years at this point. But the garden is relatively new, and it's so unfortunate that in its youth, we had to sort of abandon her. While this garden is 2.5 acres, it's not 125,000 acres. I think it has some of the guidelines that Olmsted would have approved. You walk through the main entrance gates. In other words, you do have a portal. I think it's very important that when you arrive at a special place, you know that you have arrived. And that one of the psychologists tell us one of the most impacting human experiences is walking through a portal. Water and fire are the other two. But walking through a portal is very impactful to we human. And then as the garden unfolds, you get to discover things. You get to discover certainly the sculpture that it's exhibited there, or you might get to discover a nice cocktail party that's going on, or a wonderful wedding that's going on. And as you travel the path down toward the museum, all of a sudden you get the introduction of a water feature. I think the reflecting pool, that's the second thing that impacts people. We don't have fire out there yet, but we have portal and we have water. The 130-something foot reflecting pool, I think is a feature that would encourage people, I hope, to enjoy themselves. One, whether it be to come read a book at lunch, whether it be to meet a friend at work, to look at the sculpture, whether it be to attend an event, and it doesn't really matter what season it is. The garden puts on different clothes for different seasons. In the winter, it's kind of clad in pale grays and maybe cloud-covered skies. And then in the summer and spring, it's awash with color. So my hope is that people would just enjoy it. And as you do when you go to the Biltmore House, everybody takes away their own special memory.
And such a great respite for people. And again, whenever the museum is able to open again, a place in the museum where people will certainly feel safer, being outdoors and being able to reflect and enjoy art in that setting. So we're so glad that we have it for when we are able to return.
And it follows a great legacy of our museum in that education is part of the focus. And not just education of adults, or not just education of young people, or not just, but it includes children. And I think a garden is a place that children might be a little more comfortable than any other place. And what better way to introduce a young child to the world of museums than through a pleasant afternoon in the park.
And an art gallery that, as you said, changes with every minute, hour, day.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, everyone, thank you for so wonderful to have those words and memories and be able to live in his vision and work in his vision every day. So the people who've joined us from Syracuse, thank you for taking the time to connect with our museum, to share your thoughts. We really appreciate it. And if you are ready, we are now going to transition, to our discussion of the book and IM Pei. So I'll ask you the same sort of questions. What do you think of when you think of IM Pei's designs?
Outside the box.
Outside the box?
I love his work. I think that his work has, I lived in Boston when the whole Hancock building was going on. And despite not being able to go anywhere near it because of the falling windows, just being able to stand back from it and look at the vanishing points and the way he thinks about the environment, and in terms of incorporating in the environment. And he also thinks not only of the physical environment, but the social environment. Most of his pieces really accommodate how people use the building in a very thoughtful way. And I really think that he's one of the most significant geniuses of my generation.
Oh, yes.
Alice, when I think of IM Pei, I think of these dramatic light-filled spaces and just really dynamic geometric forms, sometimes at odds with each other, but they're very successful.
The geometric form thing, yeah, that's big time.
And Peter, I think you were jumping in with something too.
Well, I was going to say his museum pieces and even some of his other buildings, they have that quality that we just talked about trying to surprise you upon entrance. In the case of our building, he deliberately designed the entrance of the building to not be on the major street that passes the building. You have to actually, you have to do some walking and some maneuvering around the building, and then you come to the surprise opening, and then walk into a huge dramatic space. And I think that's true of a lot of his buildings, that he was very interested in what I could often imagine him standing in the lobby of many of these buildings saying, I wonder what people think when they first walk through the door. When I do tours with young people, that's one of the first questions I ask them is, what happened when you walked through the door? What was your first thought? I'll shut up.
Right. No, that's fabulous. And, concrete, steel, glass, minimalism, volumes, triangles. As you said, these spaces that are suddenly revealed, sometimes that connect the elements of the building together, the interaction of light that was noted, and his real sense of urban planning and engineering that inform his practice as well, references to East Asia. Anybody else have anything? Does anybody else raising their hand? And of course, he grew up in China, attended Harvard graduate school, worked for a developer, an unconventional choice right out of school. And I think he's one of those people that sort of is I think Carter Wiseman described as sort of trying to win over traditionalists, but at the same time, not being bound to the rules of modernism. Lived in New York, collected art, enjoyed many things. I thought it was interesting. The book talked about his emphasis on the importance of self-doubt in our work. And certainly there was a whole lot about relationships with clients. And thinking about his reference to his home country, he certainly worked in China and has created some significant buildings there, but at the same time was very outspoken after Tiananmen Square, and said these events will remain in the memories of those who know the truth. And in this case, no matter how much propaganda the government puts out, it'll be hard to prevent those from seeking truth from facts. As articulated in the New York Times, and these ideas about truth seem very, very relevant in our own cultural moment. But the three buildings that we're going to focus on are the ones the author felt kind of marked the different stages of his career. The Kennedy Library being that moment he arrived on the scene, the East Gallery of the National Gallery being that it sort of announced him as a master, and then the Pyramid of the Louvre really being his chance to leave his mark on the world. I think, after he did that, he said, I'll keep working, but I'll never have another job like this. I mean, how often do you get to change the face of one of the world's oldest museums? So I'm going to try to share my screen again here. Let's see. Okay.
Yes.
So with the Kennedy Library, I mean, with these references to context and challenges, what was he really trying to achieve with the Kennedy Library? What was he called to do?
No idea.
Well, he wanted it to be both a library and a memorial to President Kennedy. That's what he discussed with Jacqueline Kennedy, and at the beginning with Robert Kennedy, that it had to have a dual purpose, really. And it was needed to be a public building as well as a scholarly center. He and the Kennedy family wanted it to be also an inspiration for young people.
Right.
So those are I think the three things that were paramount in importance for them. In the book, it's really incredible to read about what a difficult time he had getting this built. You know, there were several different site changes. There was opposition from the Cambridge community to it. And as the author points out, by the time it opened, a lot of the luster of Camelot had faded due to, you know, the events that happened in the 60s and early 70s. There was more of a mistrust of government. So he really had to deal with a lot to get this building done.
Absolutely. And he weathered so many storms during his career, right? So much controversy. In this case, the original hope being that the Kennedy School of Government would be in the building. Of course, they were ultimately separated, and that stayed at Harvard. As you said, this lack of acceptance or embrace from the Cambridge community. And as you said, trying to make a very public building for President Pei described as a public spirited president. And ultimately with its move, you know, they added a sailboat and sort of connected to the water. Other ideas about this building or how he achieved those goals? I've never been.
Either way.
I mean, there's one of those dramatic spaces that's revealed. If I can get my slides to advance here. There we go.
Oh, yeah.
That Peter was talking to us about. And just this statement of something that's so important, someone who's so important in American history, and again, a celebration of his youthfulness, his ideas about innovation, but the difficult challenge George described of having to memorialize an assassinated president in these difficult political times. Yes, Peter.
Well, I think,
I'm sorry if I can't see you guys. I can't see everybody at once, so jump in, but I did see your hand, Peter.
I often thought, before I read the book, I often thought that IM Pei wouldn't want to have anything but a challenge. Wouldn't, you know, that he kind of built controversy into his projects. We know that with the Louvre. You know, he went in there knowing that this triangle was not going to meet with a lot of love from the Parisians. And in terms of the Kennedy Center, all of the problems it had. But I think like many creative people, creative geniuses who make a mark in the world, they go into it knowing that they're going to have to battle a little bit to get what they want. And when we get to talking about the Everson, we have so many examples of how that kind of atmosphere of confrontation that he was up against inspired him and put a firm foundation on the building.
Wonderful. And speaking of the Everson, Mellon, the client for the addition to the National Gallery, really liked what he saw in the Everson and sought out Pei. And so we're looking at the original Pope building, and we know that Pei was commissioned to design the East building, which looks very different. So what were his challenges there? What did he need to achieve with his National Gallery design?
There it is.
Well, he had an unusual space to work with. It was very divided.
Mm-hmm.
And he had to figure out how to do it. And he also had to have the opening face a specific street. So that also dictated the structure of how it needed to be put out. And he divided it between these two sort of triangular pieces of land, which initially presented itself to be very difficult to figure out, but he figured out how to work that out sculpturally and how to connect them.
Great. So there's this trapezoidal footprint, not to mention he's on the National Mall, back to working within a classical context. And of course, there are just practical needs here. They needed a space to display modern art. They needed more space, more storage, some of the things that aren't that glamorous about museum life. How did he connect the two buildings? Yes, Carolyn.
He has an underground passageway, which is really marvelous. That I used to take kids down there, my students down there all the time, and they loved. I mean, everybody loves that. It was ingenious, and it was all the light you see is coming down through the flooring of the concrete. These triangles let all this light down there, and there's this glow that is just amazing.
Wonderful. So we have this underground connector as well as the courtyard we're looking at, and adding some of those things that were needed underground, like a cafe.
Yes. And their bookstore is fabulous.
Yes. Makes me want to go.
So Alice, I'm going to really date myself here. I actually was an intern at the National Gallery when he was doing this building. And my first assignment was to work in the office of the architect, which was the person who was the head of that office was David Scott, who had been another museum director, but he worked all the time with Mr. Pei. And it was very interesting to hear him talk about the kind of materials that they wanted to use in the building. And you see the limestone, really, that is the feature of the facade, and the angles that the design created. And it was interesting to hear the discussion about the resonance they wanted to create as architects with the original building. By the use of materials, and also by the way that you accessed the various levels of the buildings. Because if you've been in the West Building, you know that there's very beautiful and elegant stairways that lead from one level to another in that building. And one of the main features and Mr. Scott loved to talk about this, Dr. Scott loved to talk about this, when you would walk in to the foyer of the East Building, immediately you were engaged with this enormous, beautiful, wide stairway that was extremely modern version of the stairways that were it's to your right. It's an extremely modern version of the stairway that lower right there in your picture. That is in the West Building. And one of the things that I remember about all those discussions, and this is a little bit funny, is Dr. Scott was a little bit of a curmudgeonly guy. He was really sweet. He was a really wonderful person to work with, but he could be a little, direct and curmudgeonly. And when IM Pei's team came up with the design for the banisters that were on the stairway, originally they didn't have any banisters. If you look down and you see in that picture right there, there's a couple of what looks like poinsettias there at the very bottom and framing the stairway. And if you look really hard, you can see the stone has been completely characterized and changed by people putting their hands on it with the oils in their hands and darkening it. And there's really nothing they can do anything. They can't do anything about that. It's just an element of the composition now that these stairway banisters have this sort of oil encrusting on their edges that kind of gives definition to that stone. Now, whether that was intentional on IM Pei's part or not, I don't know. It might have been. For all I know, he had that happen somewhere else. But as you can see, the people at the National Gallery also managed to put actual handrails there to try to encourage people not to, keep doing that and turn it black. But I really thought when you walk into this space, the main resonance that I see again with the West Building is that they are both classical in their own way. Mm-hmm. The West Building is directly classical referenced in the kind of the same way ours is, with dome and column and facade with cornice and all of the more traditional Greek and Roman. But really, when you walk in this building, do you think of anything other than classical 20th century modernism? Mm-hmm. And all of the geometry, all of the beautiful materials that combine the natural material of the stone and the steel and the glass. It's just an homage to 20th century art. And I think that's really what the gallery was after too. They were not known for 20th century art. Mm-hmm. They were building that collection, and they wanted to create something that was a suitable vessel for the wonderful works of art that they were collecting by artists, not just American artists, but international artists when Fabulous. They did this building.
Fabulous. Yeah. And like you said, use the same Tennessee marble, you use dust of it in the concrete, really connected the materials. And with that Calder mobile there, this huge, and the last of his creations. And again, ideas of classical libraries and places of learning in this incredibly modern context. And everybody loved this one, right? This is one time he didn't just have to weather the storm. And, Robert Hughes wrote, it was born of sustained and highly analytical thought. It's exquisitely attuned to its site and architectural surroundings, conveying a sense of grand occasion without the slightest hint of pomposity. And the Louvre, as you've said, was a huge controversy. And I know we want to save some time for the Everson, but we read about the translator crying in the presentation because it was so vicious, and 10% of the public accepting this, and initially, and the curators writing a letter and saying that this is really an audacious concept that contributes to an architectural ensemble that for coherence and quality alike has been universally approved and accepted. But what was it that Pei had to do here? What was his special challenge here?
One of his special challenges is that, first off, only half of the building had been used for art. And there was an interest in, although there was a fight about it, an interest in using the entire, going from being an L to being a U, the entire connected building. The other was that there were so many multiple doors that they were hard for people to find. And because of that too, the traffic flow was not orderly. When they had gotten to the point where they were bringing bus loads of people in, and there was no real place to accommodate that. There also wasn't a space to do conservatorship there or office space. And, there were all sorts of challenges that had gotten embedded in the limitation of the space. And you had the politics of the area, and you had the limitation of Mitterrand having a limited amount of time before his election was coming up. And it was really his championing it that helped to push it forward, despite all of the pushback during the construction period. When he chose to do it underground, that really confused a lot of people too. And when he chose to do something very contemporary, that flew in the face of what was considered, and the fact that he wasn't an a Parisian, that he wasn't a Frenchman, that he was an American, and no less not even what they perceived as being American because he was born in China. You know, there was all sorts of ethnocentrism that he was also fighting. All of the things that he did, it's just amazing what a navigator he was, and how he showed people support, and despite all the insults that he got, he maintained his poise and his focus to achieve his goals.
Yes. One of his colleagues described him as having a golden tongue and a titanium spine. I love that. We could all use that. But yes, he had to modernize this building, built as a palace, integrate its wings. Like you said, one had been used for the finance ministry. And he really was speaking to landscape architecture in France and China, of course, the Egyptian pyramids, a lot of historic references, as well as this super contemporary clear glass pyramid that, again, has this hub downstairs where you can connect all the wings, and where you see a stairway, somewhat like what he did at Everson. And again, respecting materials, adding limestone, sand, and the concrete, connecting to the original palace. We see that stairway, that underground space. And Wiseman, who wrote this book, spent 15 years talking to Pei. He's an architecture critic. He teaches writing at Yale, and it's now time to turn it over to another professor, Peter, who's going to tell us just a little bit about the Everson, and then we have some questions to ask of him.
Well, thank you. I'm not a professor of architecture, however. I came to love the Everson when I decided to be a docent 5 years ago, and was always amazed at the architecture and wanted to learn as much about it as I could. So, but I do not speak with the professorial expertise of an architect. But I wanted to show this first image, which I think is one of the iconic things about our museum and about Pei's work. You see these boxes that are slung off of the center form of the building, this cantilevers. And when he presented these first drawings to the city of Syracuse, I understand that there were several people in the room who kind of said, well, you can't do that. You know, you can't push those blocks that far over the kind of 40% that they would not fall down. And he took that challenge and not only put 2 of them, but there's 4 of them. And those are the main galleries of the building. And he connects them, as you can see from this picture, thinking about the book and his absolute fascination with how to bring light into these structures. He does this fenestration between each of these pairs of blocks so that they look like, when you stand from this perspective, there's this illusion that they're kind of held together by air or by these panes of glass. And that is true throughout the building, that he, in the lobby, he wanted very much for light to come in naturally, but to be an integral part of the building. If you go to the next slide there, you'll see, this is the lobby here on the left. And one of the things that I'm always reminded of when I look at his buildings, especially his monumentals, is his love of the sarcophagal frame. That kind of, to me, it's very Egyptian. It's like going into the tomb of a a pyramid, and he loved that sharp, almost naked frame in that doorway. But you see the light that is coming on this wall. And one of the nice things about our museum is that this space is different depending upon the time of day. These shadows paint a whole different space in the morning than they do at night, at noon, and that they do in the late afternoon. And this was not an accident. In a city that has as much snow and moisture as we have, this was a big contention that he had to argue to get this architectural feature into the building. And it has been a pain for the building since it was built. They're always leaking and they have to be replaced, et cetera, et cetera. This picture on the right is one of my favorite views of the museum. Again, it's as though IM Pei is daring this structure to fall down, and it's just about 1.5 feet between the bottom of that frame, that box, and the top of this extension of the building. I think that's just, I can see him designing this and thinking, how much further can I push this and not have the building fall down?
Pretty bold, right? This was his first museum out on his own, right?
That's right. And the next one, this is the
Spiral.
The spiral staircase that you will see in almost all of his monumental buildings. This was the first one he tried, and he was told that he couldn't do it by the structural engineer that was assigned to work with him. And he said, yes, I can, because, they said you can't have this enormous, heavy mass of concrete standing on its own. And they worked through it and they did it. The other feature of this staircase that is part of his spirit is that he always wanted to bring elements of nature inside the buildings. And so these are what you see are the trunks of the wood, or the grain of the wood that was used to pour this structure. And both on the bottom and on the side, that wood is there to remind you of the things that buildings are made from.
And that organic and rectilinear contrast that we were just looking at in the National Gallery as well.
It's interesting that he welcomed the fact that people would be putting their hands on that balustrade. And in fact, our staircase has been worn by 50 years of hands and palm oil, and it's darkened it. But it has a beautiful patina.
Well, Peter, how would you describe your visitors' experience of the building in the galleries? You told us a little bit about interacting with students, but how do people experience the museum?
Well, I think, it is a brutalist building. It is smack dab in the middle of our city. And so people see it, they pass by it. Some people think it's ugly. And so when somebody first goes into it, and this is all in my imagination, but I would think when somebody first goes into it and they enter that magnificent lobby space, and there's so much space and there's so much light, that they are there's kind of awestruck. And I always tell the students, I ask them, what is the largest work of art in this building? And I go, oh, and I say, it's the building itself, because it is a work of art. But I'm going to shut up because I have so many of my fellow docents here who can share their thoughts about what the museum is like to people. Carolyn? Linda?
Okay, for me, when they come into the building, it is a brutalist building. It can be, I've heard people say it's cold, that it has no feeling or personality. I think when you walk into the building and you let the light take you in, and the softening, that spiral staircase really is the softening factor of the brutalist look that you see outside, and the cantilevers are heavy. You're wondering how in the world are they staying up? And you go in this lovely organic spiral. That, if anything, that wins many, many people over. I've witnessed it many times. That's all I'm going to say.
Do y'all think people are coming to see the art or the architecture? And as docents, how do you balance that?
Can I just make a comment,
Please,
Alice?
yeah.
One of the things is we do not have a classical museum building here. Our courthouse is absolutely classical. But for many of the students, especially to whom we give tours, they don't come with a preconception of what a museum might look like. And I think that gives us an advantage. They're not walking up the steps to the Met with columns, you know, and what have you. So they're open to almost anything. And I think for a lot of them who have grown up with modern science fiction and what have you, I think it looks, I don't think it surprises them as much as it does those of us who are older. I think it wows their imagination.
Fantastic. Thank you.
I think that there's a kind of majesty, and Norma's nailed it, that for the young people, they're coming into a space that they have never seen before, unless they have traveled the world and seen some of these large spaces. But I just think it knocks them out, and it's hard to keep their attention on the art, because the other thing about that I don't want to pass over is that in this building, he was able to achieve something that he wasn't able to achieve in any of his other museums. And that was this pinwheel design, where when you get to the top of those stairs, you can see what you're going to see. You can see where to go. You see that there are 4 galleries. You can see into all of the galleries from that position at the top of the stairs that we call the pinwheel. And I think it's such a wonderful design concept. We have a museum down the road in Utica that is a wonderful museum, but to me, it's absolutely impossible to figure out when I enter it, where do I want to go, and where should I go, and what do I want to see? Because it's a box of rectangles that are concealed from one another in the lobby. But he wanted, I believe, that his plan was this pinwheel design would reveal to you everything that you were going to see in the time you were going to spend in the museum.
Thank you. And several of your colleagues have commented about weather and being in different climates. With your interest in architecture, have you discovered any special practices needed for the care and maintenance of the museum?
Well, I'm not an expert on it, but I know that it's always being worked on. It's always being, the stone is always being, this summer, much of the stone was cleaned and refaced. But it is, I'll talk in a minute about his other building in Syracuse, but he was not going to worry about the weather. He was not going to let weather, this is my conception, he wasn't going to let weather stop him from doing what he wanted to do. And a lot of people say those 2 buildings, the last place in the world you'd want to put them is in Syracuse, New York. With the snow.
The flat roof, Peter. The flat roof.
Exactly.
10 feet of snow a year.
Thank you.
Doesn't do well.
I think the museum will do better when the major highway that they built that separates Syracuse University from downtown. If that comes downtown, there will be less pollution. And I think that's going to help the museum facade weather better.
Yes.
Well, did you encounter IM Pei?
I did in two ways. Do you want me to tell that story?
Sure, we'd love to hear it.
I was the first building that IM Pei built in Syracuse was at the university, and it is the center of what we call the Newhouse Communications Center. And Sam Newhouse, who was one of the wealthiest people in the world, was a benefactor of the university. And he gave the university the money to build what's called Newhouse One, the first building. And I was a good friend. I am a good friend of his son, Donald Newhouse. And when I wanted to make a film about IM Pei. And so I talked to Donald and I said, is there anything you know that I could talk to who could get to IM Pei? And he did get me to be able to stand next to IM Pei in New York City. But the better part of this story is that when Donald Newhouse was a teenager, he remembered that his family gave a dinner party for Jackie Kennedy. And it was at the time that Newhouse had given the money to the university and they were searching for an architect. And somehow Jackie Kennedy knew this. And so she asked if she could bring a guest to the dinner. And Donald said that his father said, no, who is it? And, we only want the brightest and the best. And she said, it's this young architect named IM Pei. And she said to Sam Newhouse, if you're going to give the money to build a classroom building up in snow country, and you don't want it to just be a block of classrooms and not very distinguished, hire this guy to build it. And so they met with Pei. He charmed the Newhouses, and they hired him to build the first building. And the first building really is, I had my office in it, so I knew its leaks, I knew its creaks, but I knew its absolute beauty. And I think it's an even more beautiful building than some of his other buildings, but it's hidden away up in Syracuse, New York. But a lot of the ideas, like the fenestration, using the glass to connect the blocks and to bring light into the building, he was trying all that out on what we call Newhouse One. And if you go up on the campus and you walk by the Newhouse One building, you will see all these echoes of the Everson Museum, because he was trying a lot of this stuff out, even to the point of he put an atrium in the middle of the building with a glass ceiling. And Norma, you know what that meant. That glass ceiling has leaked and done nothing but cost the university millions of dollars. But that's my favorite story about IM Pei, is that Jackie Kennedy, she had already been in conversation with him about the Kennedy Center, but this was 1962, sorry, and the ground hadn't even been dug on the Kennedy library at that time. My story about getting close to IM Pei is I did want to make this film before he died, and I was convinced that if all I had to do was stand and talk to him and he would be charmed and sit down and give me an interview. And his son, I talked to his son in Los Angeles, and his son said, you're never going to get him to give an interview because he hates that kind of thing. But he said, I'll tell you what, if you go, his apartment is down by the United Nations building in New York City. And every morning at about 8 o'clock, he walks his dog out there. And if you can find a way to talk to him and he doesn't sick the dog on you, or he doesn't tell you to get lost, go ahead. And so I did that. I went down and I sat on a park bench, and sure enough, he came walking down and he came walking towards me, but he had 3 nurses with him.
Oh.
They looked like the Nurse Ratched in Over the Cuckoo's Nest. And they were so intimidating to me that I stayed seated on this bench as they walked by. Never got my interview with him.
Well, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts and stories with us. I know we need to close, but any final comments from you, Peter?
No, thank you very much for doing this. I think this is a wonderful thing that makes us all happy that we have these 2 museums so far apart, and yet having a book club meeting together. And I hope we can do that more.
Well, thanks to Cassandra for connecting us, and we would love to work with you again and have our docents get together, and any way we can help you. Does anybody have anything you must say before Cassandra closes us?
I'm to Syracuse for a field trip.
Yay! We'd love to. We'd love to.
Beautiful.
In the summer.
Yeah, in the summer.
And the fall.
Yes.
The fall.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I don't think that we're built for taking a trip in the winter up there. So, just in conclusion, I'm so glad we were able to have this discussion and to have, a little bit of that kind of memorial to Jim at the beginning of this, and really thinking about his work at our museum and how he was able to incorporate such a wonderful design that allows us to have such a welcoming and inviting atmosphere for all that come and view not only our works, but our building and our larger, green space around it in the cultural park. But, I really want to thank the Everson docents who are here today, and all the connections we made at the Everson, getting all of this coordinated, because it's just amazing to hear about other places and how the architecture really affects what they do and affects the way the visitors interact with their space and their art. And, just personally, I grew up in New York, and so I went to Syracuse University, and I actually taught in Newhouse. And I, and I visited the Everson on several occasions. It's probably been about 6 years since I've been there, but I immediately, when I saw this book listed as one of the picks, I immediately reached out to Alice and I said, let's get the Everson on board, because they have such an interesting building. They have such an interesting story. I know they're going to add some value to this. So again, I just want to thank you all for making time to coordinate with us and to be here today. And thank you, Alice, for leading this great discussion. And to thank all of you who took time out today to sit and talk with us. And we hope that you enjoyed the program, and, just have a great day.
Cassandra, did you know Dom Iacano?
I did, yeah.
He was my next door neighbor.
Oh, was he?
Well, small world. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank